Owen and Orlando, thanks for joining Spectator TV. Owen, in this week's magazine, you wonder whether ultimately Putin has lost the plot. Are you surprised by his decision to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine?
I'm not just surprised, I'm completely flabbergasted. But actually, more importantly than me, I've just spent the whole morning on Twitter and Signal and Facebook and with all my Russian contacts, many of whom have worked in the Putin apparat, in the diplomatic service, in his media machine for 2 decades. And Russians are amazed. I mean, people who think they know what's going on, top journalists, people who work for Putin in the Kremlin, who have been supporting his propaganda effort for years, they are surprised. And they actually didn't think it was going to happen. Basically, Sunday, everyone was still on the diplomatic channel. Lavrov, everyone was all calling Western claims of an imminent invasion hysteria. And then it suddenly changed. And there's 2 explanations for that. Either that the diplomacy was a bluff and war was a plan all along, or that something changed in principle and Putin decided at the last minute, for reasons that are very hard to fathom, to completely abandon not just diplomacy, but apparently all kind of self-interest. Because I think one thing that we have been saying all along, both Orlando and I, is actually true, is that the one scenario in which he absolutely loses all the diplomatic leverage that he has, all of the strategic ambiguity that he's built up, all of the allies that he's been cultivating inside Europe in his divide and conquer, all of that he loses with a full-scale invasion, and he's invaded. It's totally inexplicable and completely counterproductive as I see it.
Orlando, are you also perplexed by recent events?
Yes, I'm shocked and saddened and disgusted, as everybody is. And we're at a point where we really can't tell what's in Putin's planning. We can certainly tell what he's been reading and what he's been saying and the sort of ideologies that he's been playing with that have led him to this point. I think that he has moved in an imperial direction in terms of sort of civilizational thinking. He's taken on board a lot of ideas from people like Carl Schmitt to believe that there are hegemonic states, of which Russia is one, and there are other entities like Ukraine, which are not even to be given sovereign status. So he's been perhaps isolated too long, reading too many weird Nazi jurists and other ideologists of a pan-Slav Eurasian ilk that would lead him in this direction to think that he is able to do this. Is that a sign of madness, of dislocation from reality? I think probably it is. In which case, I think, like many Russian rulers of that nature that have embarked on foreign adventures before, and I'm thinking of Nicholas I and the First Crimean War, it will mean the end of his regime fairly quickly. On the other hand, all the signs are, and the confidence of the rhetoric would suggest, that they've been planning this for a very, very long time. So I think that he still has a lot of levers to pull, he still has a lot of influence to call upon, and he still has a number of threats to make, perhaps even to our own political establishment, or any political establishment that tries to cross him. So, this is a KGB war as well as a Ministry of Defence war. And it's a war in which everything is weaponized. Disinformation, social media, cyber warfare, as well as troops on the ground and all the deployments we've seen in the last few hours. So who knows? Who knows where we are? It would be a fool now to say that they thought they knew what was going to happen next.
And Orlando, just on the historical perspective here, I wonder, you mentioned how ultimately Putin, in how he is speaking and how he sees things, he's suggesting that Ukraine is not a country, it's part of Greater Russia effectively. Can you talk us a bit more through his perspective on this and ultimately where Greater Russia ends?
Yeah, well, the article that everyone cites is his long piece, slightly bizarre piece that the Kremlin published last year, July 2021. And he's really repeating a number of strands that he's already made in his speeches and articles, namely that Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are all one nation. They all share the same foundation in Kievan Rus. So we saw this really come to the fore in 2016 when he opened this monument to the Grand Prince Vladimir in Moscow, who, of course, is also claimed by the Ukrainians as the founder of their European state. For Putin, he's the founder of the great Russian state, of which a tripartite state, if you like, of which Belarus and Ukraine are one. So this is his civilizational thinking I was referring to. And in that foundation myth, there's no place for a Ukrainian statehood. This, again, is something that, the ideas of Carl Schmitt that he's been borrowing from feed into. The idea that only certain cultural national formations have statehood at their heart. So Russia has a statehood, and Ukraine has always been, for Putin, just a borderland. Ukraina, the original Slav word for Ukraine, just does mean borderland. And so it's, and then in other articles, Putin has said, for example, that, Ukraine as a nation state was invented by the Bolsheviks. So that you can see, given the historiography he comes from, basically Soviet, you can see sort of where he's coming from. I mean, it's mad, but his argument is that it was only the Bolsheviks in drawing up the constitution of the Soviet Union that Ukraine was given its first nationhood. Well, the Ukrainians would say nonsense. They would trace their nationhood back to Kievan Rus, or they would trace their nationhood back to the Cossack hetmanate of the 17th century, which looked for help from Russia originally, or they would point to the independent Ukraine of 1917 to 18. Which very quickly became a German puppet state and then got embroiled in civil war before the Soviet Union was formed with a Soviet Republic as part of it. So, Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So you can see that it's a whole mishmash of historical ideas and ideologies that Putin is weaponizing here or drawing from to justify his sort of worldview of Russia as a hegemonic state and Ukraine as simply a subordinate state, if you like, or a subordinate entity, which has to be included in a bigger civilization. That's how I think he views the world. And it is wacky, it is mad, it is certainly not fit for purpose in a post-1991 world where we do live by, we hope, international standards and principles of sovereignty. But that is just not how Putin has come to see it, unfortunately.
And Owen, where is, I suppose, Russian public opinion on this? Is there a sense amongst the people that, Ukraine is a part of Russia or, should be more in locksync with it?
Well, first, I mean, just to Orlando's point, I mean, something, an analogy that might be more familiar to English or British viewers is actually the very ambiguous relationship between Britain in the First World War and Ireland, for instance, or longer term, the Scottish kingdom's flirtation with France. It's always the relationship between Russia and Ukraine is of close neighbours which have at various points been part of the same state, which have been flirting with enemies and are flirting with enemies. Now, the really big question is, will Russia's very rushed, very amateurish, very last-minute propaganda campaign manage to swing a majority of Russian opinion behind a full-scale invasion? I don't think so far. I personally don't believe that a long-term occupation of all of Ukraine is anything that Vladimir Putin is contemplating. It's certainly not what he's preparing his people for. But the clearly defending Donbass and the Russians of the eastern Ukraine against genocide is now the line. Depressingly, it seems that Russian viewers claim in public opinion surveys to be quite fantastically gullible and with the program. So the very latest polls that have come out say that 50% at least support the war. But the reliability of polls is always a big question mark, because, for instance, the VETSA-EOM, the state-controlled polling center, not the independent Levada one, but literally the state-controlled one, came out with a poll when they open-endedly ask Russians to name a politician they trust. Only 21% say Vladimir Putin. When you ask them on a multiple choice, which of these politicians do you trust most, then Putin comes out at 68%. So is his support 21% or is it 68%? It depends how you ask the question. It's a very ambiguous issue. Now, so far, the messaging has in the past worked. In 2008, it was a question of the Georgians have attacked South Ossetia, and the Russian public were able to believe that package, which was in fact somewhat true. The Georgians did attack South Ossetia briefly, that Russia was responding to a provocation. In Crimea, there was a gigantic preamble. There was actually 3 months of profound unrest in Kiev. The revolution of dignity, as the Ukrainians call it, the effective as a democratic people power coup against the pro-Russian government of Viktor Yanukovych, was presented as a fascist coup, and there was lots of time to prepare the Russians for that. Here, all of those arguments about the fascists in Kiev, about aggression, has been compressed into 48 hours. It's amazingly rushed. It's as though they've just sort of decided to sort of run out of the building and just grab every single ideological argument that they have and off the shelf and just sort of throw it at the Russian public and see what will happen and whether it'll stick. I mean, I think that there is a profound ambiguity and there's a ambivalence, I would say, between the relationship between Russians and Ukrainians, because they actually have, so many Russians have close family ties with Ukraine. I mean, they do indeed consider Ukraine to be part of their own country in many ways. I mean, that's a very common attitude, that it's just sort of a little part of our great nation. But that argument has that's a stick with two ends, as the Russians say, is that the Russians consider it part of their country. Does that mean that they're actually going to allow their sons or be happy about their sons going to war against Ukrainian ordinary people? I don't know. It's the most, the one thing it is clear is that this is the most severe and extreme stress test that Russian propaganda has ever had to face. And if Putin loses it, then that really is the end of his regime. And he's started it in an extraordinarily rushed, amateurish way, which has amazed and shocked even most Russians, even many Russians who support him.
And Owen, just briefly on that, one of the points you've made when you've been covering this crisis is that you thought a full-scale invasion was unlikely because ultimately Putin had not been preparing the people for it. Have we seen in the past, few days him start to do that? Do you think the Russian people are prepared for the war that he has now announced?
Well, that's the messaging has changed. I mean, it hasn't changed to let's incorporate Ukraine into Russia. That's not the messaging. The messaging is let's defend the Russians of Eastern Ukraine from fascists and genocidal killers in the form of Ukrainian nationalists. So, I mean, even at the moment, even now that there's been this sort of step change, this complete sort of pivot towards an actual invasion, the messaging in Russian state media is still not a full-scale invasion. It's about punishing the fascists for launching an aggressive war, as the Russian media has been portraying it, against the Russian-speaking peoples of Eastern Ukraine.
And Orlando, just finally, if we have a situation where we talked a lot about the risk here in terms of, Putin announcing this, where it could go very wrong for him, why this is by far one of the most tricky paths he could have picked, the most difficult, in fact. But were this to go to plan for Putin, what does that look like? And what is he trying to do in terms of writing his legacy and changing Russian history?
Well, we don't know what his plan is. I mean, so we can't really say. But I think Owen's point is a good one about, support, whether this would be coming from the Russian population. I mean, still 70% of the population is entirely dependent on television for its news. So he can control that increasingly aged part of the population. But I'm sceptical about whether there's going to be a big anti-war movement in Russia, because he's crushed civil society so effectively. and it's so fragmented that people have become despondent. So we'll see about that, whether he can see it through. I don't think there can be a success for Putin from this point on, and I think and very much hope it spells the end of his regime. And I suspect, coming back to this rhetoric of defending the Russian people from genocide, etc., I suspect that has actually more to do with Putin's own weirdly twisted reading of post-Cold War history and his attempt to get back at the West for what he sees probably as the beginning of all of this confrontation with the West, which is Kosovo. Because if you remember, NATO went into Kosovo supposedly to save the Albanians from genocide, from the Serbian Milosevic regime. And I think that's the point at which the Russians see the beginning of this new confrontation, this new Cold War, if you like, with the West. So it's almost as if he's saying to the West, in his own ideological thinking, his echo chamber, as Owen put it in his piece, it's almost as if he's saying to the West, I'm going to fight you by your own principles. I'm going to call out the genocide you're bringing about to our Russian speakers, our people, as he would put it, although they're, of course, citizens of a sovereign state. And this is so now divorced from reality that one wonders who it's going to convince, other than himself and the sort of mad ideologists who surround him or who've been influencing his thinking. And I doubt even whether it will convince, will Lavrov really be convinced by this sort of rhetoric as the occupation of Ukraine becomes more and more bloody and messy? I don't know. I suspect it will probably accelerate any fragmentation of his own regime between, hawks and doves, between those who may want to return to the diplomatic path rather than get Russia deeper and deeper into this mire into which it's now launched itself.